All right, good morning, everyone. So this is going to be our fun week. We're actually going to start working on some HTML and CSS and developing a version of what our full stack application would look like. Now, in order to build a full stack application, we need to understand a couple of things, right? We need to understand that we have a front end, a back end, and then we have a some sort of a database. And I actually have a drawing for that, I believe. So let me see if I could pull it up here. There you are. Okay. Okay, everyone should be able to see this drawing. Please don't pay attention too much into everything that's on this paper right now, because obviously this would be a little confusing, not knowing exactly what's going on. But today we're going to see how our local machine is actually interacting with our server, right? We're going to see how to deploy our front end, and our front end, although today is going to be basically just React and HTML. Although today all it's going to be is HTML and CSS. Later on, what we'll see is that we have a React project being able to develop and run on our local machine. Today, when we run our local machine, we're going to run it on something called live server. And that live server is going to actually utilize one of the ports in our local machine to host our HTML page. Later on this week, we're going to, actually tomorrow, we're going to start diving into databases, and that's going to cover a Postgres workflow. And then we'll start talking about backend servers, which in this week we'll utilize a framework called Flask. But later on, we'll dive into Django and how Django comes in with all kinds of built-in things to allow us to work a little bit better. I'll share this drawing with everyone. I can't remember where exactly on our curriculum it is, but it is in our curriculum. You can take a look, try to read through what's going on in the processes here. As you can see, it describes everything, right? So our local machine starts. After our local machine starts, it contacts a server to grab our front end, which is just our HTML. Our HTML gets rendered on the screen. And after our HTML gets rendered on the screen, our HTML may or may not make a request to our backend, which is going to be our server built with Python. And then that server is going to communicate with the database to grab information and return it to our front end. It may seem like a lot right now, but hopefully by the end of this week, it makes a lot more sense. So all of these days throughout this week will be introductory days. Hopefully they don't take too long, but they're going to be for us to kind of dip our toes into the water of understanding how the web development process works. We're going to get 1 day per each portion of this cycle. And then afterwards, we'll dive into our actual frameworks where we'll go ahead in detail and cover for weeks at a time, our front end, weeks at a time, our back end. And then I believe we have 1 week dedicated to our database. Okay. So does anyone have any questions about full stack development, how it works, why it's important? Any questions on the subject? Oh, go ahead, Clarice.
When you said the live server is run from your local machine, does that mean if the internet connection is cut, that the web page then is gone? Or is it just like it'll stay up and then have to go back to your machine for updates?
Yeah, that's a great question. So your local machine is literally, it's your computer itself, right? It's not contacting the internet at all right now. And anything that's being ran solely on your local machine shouldn't need any connection to the internet. So you could do your entire development process on your local machine without connecting to the internet. The problem comes once you're utilizing something like third-party APIs, right? Where you have to communicate with the internet in order to grab information. But as far as your own web development and your own resource, you could run that all without any form of internet connection. Does that answer your question, Clarice?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Any other questions? Okay, great. It doesn't seem like there are any other questions. So let's go ahead and dive into our lecture. So what is HTML? I'm sure I'm sure we have students here from FOP. I'm sure we have people who have messed around with web development before. Can anybody take a jab at what HTML is?
It stands for hypertext markdown language, and you basically use it to, well, I guess nowadays to set up the structure for a website.
Yeah, that's a great. Thanks, Frank. I appreciate that. Yeah. So basically HTML, when the internet was first being created, everything kind of ran a computer before used to just be quite literally the terminal, right? And there was no mouse, there wasn't anything. And then people would run all their commands and grab resources from the internet through terminal commands, and they would make requests that way. Well, eventually somebody was like, well, hey, this isn't the best type of displaying something. What if we need to keep track of records or have linked to sources and different directories, which is essentially what we have now, right? It's just directories within other directories, folders within folders, and then files within those folders. Well, somebody came up with the idea of the hypertext markup language, I apologize, which is basically everything inside of a file. You can able to read it, and then certain portions of that text are linking to other files, right? And that's what the internet used to be before. It used to be just an HTML page that had text on it, and then one link led to another page. And it was originally created to be able to keep track of records. I believe it was some college or some science. I should know this off the top of my head, but it was some sort of science department that came up with this as a way to keep track of their records, and it just kind of spread. Well, as we know, nowadays, it's not necessarily just that. It's not just text with links to something. The web has evolved, HTML has evolved over time, and now we have all kinds of different ways of styling it and making it look nice and pretty in order to get the websites that we get nowadays. Well, let's go ahead and talk about the document structure about index.html. So I created a file here called index.html. Here on the left side, I have the README over all the tags that we're going to be covering this morning. And the first thing that I want to cover is going to be the doc type tag. So here we have doc type HTML. Now, why is that tag important? Right? I'm sure people who have developed an HTML before have placed this tag somewhere, but they don't necessarily understand what's going on. I didn't used to understand what was going on when I used it. I just knew that I had to put it on my document in order for the browser to be able to read my HTML document. Well, when I run this on the browser, right, the browser essentially sends a request for a file, because the browser doesn't know what it's supposed to show to the client, right? And the computer only knows what you tell it to do. So it sends a GET request to our local machine for this index.html template. Then our index.html template gets pasted on the browser, and we tell it, hey, this is what you have to show to the client or whoever's visiting this site. Okay, so then the browser says, well, what type of document type is it? So this is where we specify, hey, here's the doc type. Browser, take a look here, and this is an HTML. So then the browser says, oh, okay, there's an HTML template. I can render this, all right? Does anyone have any questions about this doc type tag? Pretty easy? Okay, perfect. So then after this, we start working on our HTML structure. So the first tag that we'll need is HTML. And this is how it knows, oh, okay, the doc type is HTML, so I'm supposed to look for content wrapped within HTML tags. So now we have our HTML tags opening up our content. And then after that, all we need is a head, and we need a body. And that's it. This is enough to actually render something on the screen, right? This is going to tell the browser, hey, browser, this is an HTML document. I need you to render everything that's wrapped within HTML tags. The browser says, okay, perfect. I'm going to grab this in the index.html. I'm going to look for the HTML tags, and then I'm going to interpret all of the code that's wrapped within those HTML tags. Now, when I say all of the code, we have this head section and we have this body section. The head section isn't something that we can necessarily visualize or that we'll be able to see on our actual web page being developed. But this is kind of like a, hey, before you start rendering the body, you need to make sure that everything in head is completed. Once you have everything in head done, then start rendering the body of my HTML. All right, it's kind of like a heads up or a setup requirement that we're giving to the browser. And then our body is what actually has the content of what shows up in our web page. Does anyone have any questions about this?
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Do these tags need to be indented in a certain way?
Yeah, it's a great question. So when it comes to the tags being indented, I think that's kind of just I don't want to say up to you, but at least indent once every time a tag is wrapped, right? So HTML, that's the first tag that I have in here. It's not wrapped by anything. Now head is wrapped by the HTML tags, so I tab it in. Body is not wrapped by head, but it is wrapped by the HTML tags. So then it's tabbed and it's in line with head. Does that make sense?
Yep, that makes sense. Thank you.
Of course. All right. So now the next thing that I wanted to show everyone, and this might work actually. Let's take a look here. Yeah, great. So now if you take a look at your browser, just open up a browser window, right click, and then you could click on inspect. Now, when you click on inspect, it's going to bring up all kinds of resources. We don't have to talk about everything that's here just yet, but just look at the elements directory. All right. So we click on elements. We can see here that this is a doc type HTML. So the browser sent a request, and this is the file that was rendered to the browser. It said, hey, this is going to be a doc type HTML. Browser says, okay, fine. What do you want me to do with it? Here's the HTML that I want you to take a look at. Okay, so it finds the HTML tags and it says, this is the stuff that I have to render. Well, let's take a look at head. Inside of head, we see all of these. We see this meta charset UTF, which we'll cover here shortly. We see a couple of style tags. We'll see all of these tags that we'll cover shortly. But the one that we see that we're actually able to see on the browser is this title new tab, right? Where do we see that?
Up at the top of the new tab.
Yeah, we can see it right here, right? It actually says new tab and it has an icon. And I believe our icon is also here. Let me see, custom style. Or our icon is somewhere up here in the header as well. But here we can see that the title has the new tab, and that's what's actually showing up on the tab. But that's everything we're able to see from head. Everything else is not actually being displayed anywhere, right? I can't see all of these other things that are being explained here. But if I take a look at the body, now in the body, the first thing it shows is, hey, there's a background image. Okay, and if I hover over the background image, we can see that my browser highlights everything, right? Hover over the background image, highlights everything. So I can see what falls into the background image, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, great. So now I have this NTP app, which I'm sure is just a custom tag that they created to be able to do things. Let me see what else they have here. No, it's not able to, it doesn't show me the remainder of the code. No. Okay, but we can see how inside of this body tag, they have this iframe that says background. And then after that, they're rendering another HTML document, which is actually rendering everything here in the center. But it looks like that code is inaccessible to me. Okay. Now, when we think about web development and we think about HTML specifically, I would like everyone to just think about boxes, right? Maybe Amazon might be a better display for this. Okay, there you go. So there's Amazon. And here we can see that if I scroll down here, oh, where's the body? Jesus. Okay, let's see. So that is the body. All right, I'll do it this way. Okay, so we can see that everything here is a box in itself, right? As I hover over a specific element on my Chrome, on my console down below, it's changing what I'm highlighting, right? It's taking me to anchor tags. It's taking me to different things that I'm hovering over. We can see all the code in the bottom changing as I'm hovering over different elements. And all this is showing me is all of the HTML code that's embedded, right? It's all nested. And it's showing me rows. Here we can see that this is some sort of like table with one row and a couple of columns. And as I scroll down, we can see that each card also has its individual elements. All right, so we see that this card has a header, and then inside of the card, I have a couple of rows as well. All right, it's all just boxes within boxes. Basically, what I'm looking at here is something like this. So I can see we have, oh, hello, what's going on here? I have my web page, right? Inside of my web page, I have some sort of header. Now below that header, I have a nav bar. And in that nav bar, I may have a couple of buttons. Okay, so there's my nav bar. And then I have my body, all right? So there's my body. Or some sort of division tag that's actually holding everything. And in here, I have a couple of rows and columns. So I have 3 rows. That fit. Okay, so I have 3 rows, and each one of these are divided into 3 columns, right? Oh, which isn't working correctly. Let's delete that. I'm gonna try the pencil. Don't make fun of my lines. Okay, so there's my really terrible line, and I have my 3 columns in there. And then in there, I have a card for each one of these. All right, and then I have more cards over here in these sections as well. And that's all the web page is. It's just boxes inside of other boxes, right? It's really nothing too extremely complicated. It just gets to look nice and pretty once we actually add styling into it. But that's all this is. It's just formatted boxes with nice, pretty colors. Okay. Does anyone have any questions about this like document structure so far? Go ahead, Clarice.
Just a question about when you said a card, is that like a button, or what did you mean by a card?
Oh, when I was mentioning to a card, I was referencing to one of these. Right, like this box specifically here. I'm referencing to it as a card. So here we can see, you see that little white header that pops up to the upper left-hand side of the card as I hover on it.
Yeah.
It's a division, and then it has like an ampersand on it, and then it says card instance. So that's telling me that this is some sort of class named card, and that's why I reference to it as card. But it's just a box.
Okay.
Awesome. Any other questions?
Does that box structure come from HTML?
It does, yes. So you could utilize a table, or we can utilize other libraries. Like once we go into responsive web design, we'll learn about React Bootstrap and Tailwind to be able to style our web pages. So those things you can also use to create those cards. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Yes.
Perfect. All right, so now we have our head, and we saw that the one thing that we're able to create on it is this tag named title. And now we know what the title tag does. So let's say we just call this Victor Platoon, right? If I go here to my VS extensions, you can see, where are you? Okay, can't find it. Let me look it up real quick. I have this live server extension. And this live server extension, what it does is it's able to grab your HTML template and host it on one of your local hosts. Okay, once you have this extension installed, all you have to do is click on the file that you want it to host, and then you're going to see on the lower right-hand corner a Go Live button. You click on Go Live, it's going to tell you it's starting. And then not only is it telling me it's starting, but it tells me the server is started at port 64988. So within my local machine, port 64988 is being utilized to host this index HTML. So then when I go to a browser and I go to my local machine, which is 127.0.0.1, and I tell it to go into port 64988, it goes into the directory that I'm currently in. It goes into the other directory I'm currently in, and then it renders index.html. Once it renders index.html, I can click on inspect, and we can see the only thing on there is doc type, the HTML. If I look at head, I can see title Victor Platoon. And if we look at the tab says Victor Platoon. If I click on body, we can see that there's nothing on the body as well. All right. So it's rendering my HTML correctly. Okay, and I know it's rendering it correctly because if I erase Platoon from here, when I come back to it, we see that it did an automatic reload. So every time I change anything on the HTML template, the live server updates, and it tells me that now the tab is only supposed to say Victor. Okay, so now I have that running. I've gone over doc type, HTML, head. We talked a little bit about body. We talked about title. But now meta. What is meta? And why do we even want to use it? Well, meta is a tag that's used to describe specific requirements, right? And I think one of them is like UTF. Oh man, I forgot what the let me do this. There you go. Okay, so this is a shortcut that I can use. I will show everyone here shortly. But here we see we have a meta tag, and that meta tag is specifying, hey, what character set are we utilizing? Okay, well, we're going to utilize the standard character set of UTF-8. Okay, great. That's going to go inside of my head because this is a prerequisite to my body, right? My body needs to know what kind of character set it's going to use to be able to display the content within my body. Excuse me. Adam got me sick. No, I'm just kidding. And then the next part is going to be, we see another meta tag, and it's telling me, hey, this is the name related to the viewport. So this is telling the browser, hey, in relationship to the viewport, everything that we display, I want you to display it in a 1-to-1 ratio with the device that's being utilized, right? So if I was rendering something for a different device, or if I was rendering something for a specific size of a screen, I may want to change this initial scale, or I may want to change the specific content that I'm giving it. All right, and telling it, hey, I want you to utilize the entire device width of whatever is rendering this HTML template. And I want you to do a 1-to-1 ratio of all the sizes that I'm passing on. All right, and we're going to see this taking more effect once we're actually working with CSS. Okay, so now we have our link tag, our script, and style tags. But these three we're going to go ahead and cover once we start moving into CSS and moving into how to include JavaScript with our index HTML. So we'll leave these three as pending. Let me make a new section in pending here. All right. So now let's talk about, well, before I keep moving, we just covered all the document structure elements to be able to structure an HTML template. Does anyone have any questions over the document structure elements? Okay, There are no questions, so let's go ahead and move on to our content structures. So in our content structure, I have this body, right? I was able to give it a title named Victor Platoon. But what if I want to create a website named, I don't know, Victor Platoon's e-commerce website or something like that? Anybody want to think of a title for our site? Okay, Victor Platoon it is. We'll go with that again. So then I could give it an H1 header, right? And named it Victor Platoon. Now the question is, well, what am I going to see on my actual browser once I've made this change? Well, let's check it out. If I look at the browser, all right, in head, I have this char set UTF. So now it knows what kind of character set it's supposed to be using. And then I have this meta tag telling it how to apply the sizes that I'm passing into it. Okay, great. Well, what if I look at the body? In the body, I see that I have this Victor tag. Okay, well, I have this H1 element, and we can see that when I hover over it, it highlights exactly what my H1 element is and how much space it's occupying on my web page. All right, so let's talk a little bit about that spacing. So I click on this element, and it shows me that I have Victor Platoon. All right, but here on the right-hand side, I have a couple of different sizes applying to it, and a couple of things that it tells me about the styles. So one, it tells me that the style of the H1 element, here's everything it comes with automatically. We'll talk about this once we get into CSS. And then here is the most important part. It tells me a margin. It tells me, hey, this is the space it's all occupying. And again, we'll talk more about these sizes once we get into CSS later on this afternoon. All right, so now I know this is occupying this much space, and this is an H1 element. Let's say I think that this is a lot of space. Well, luckily HTML has developed so much over time that your headers can be in different sizes, kind of like a markdown file, right? Maybe you want to start off with an H1, but then as you progress and you start making more and more headers, you want to change them. So maybe here we have an H2. An H3, and an H4. All right, well, what happens when we see that? Well, we can see each one of them getting smaller. We can see their sizes changing. So now an H1, we can see here that the font size is 2EM. As I scroll down to the next one, we see that the font size turns into a 1.5, a 1.17, a 1.133, and so on. All right, these sizes are going to get smaller and smaller as the tags get bigger. Now for header tags, you only have H1 through H6. And let me go ahead and place that here. H1 through H6. H6 being the smallest and H1 being the biggest. All right. So that's header tags. Let's talk a little bit about paragraph tags. Well, paragraph tag is exactly that. It's supposed to wrap a paragraph, right? I can say, good morning, Victor Platoon. I hope you all had, there probably should be a comma there, but excuse my grammar. I hope you all had a great weekend. It's nice to see you all this morning. Okay, so now when I come over to my webpage, I can see I have Victor Platoon, which is my initial header. And then I see I have a P tag. And in that P tag, I see, good morning, Victor Platoon. I hope you all had a great weekend. It's nice to see you all this morning, which is exactly what I have here. Now notice that I pressed enter, right? I made a new line here. But when I go to my webpage, there is no new line, right? Well, that's because everything that's inside of a P tag is assumed that it's just supposed to keep going within the same paragraph until it reaches the very end of the space that's available to it. So if I do something like lorem, oh, hello. Okay, so now I have all of this extra stuff, right? I just put in, if you type in lorem, it's gonna give you this tool. It's just gonna come up with a bunch of words that don't necessarily mean anything. So I just put lorem to come up with a bunch of gibberish that I can put on there. And now when I come over, I can see that once it runs out of space, right? Once it finally runs out of space on the right-hand side, that's when it indents and creates a new line. All right. Well, now the question is, well, what happens if I have another p tag within this p tag? Will it then make an indentation on its own? So let's see that. Let's say I have a p tag wrapped within another p tag. Okay, so now everything's properly formatted. Do we think that we're going to see an indentation, or do we think that it's all just going to keep going the way it was before?
Keep going.
Yeah, well, let's check it out. So we can see that it stopped, right? We have good morning, and then it stops, creates a new line because our p tags are now nested and separated. Oh, wait a minute. Are they? They are not nested. Why is that? Ooh, I made a mistake in my HTML template, it looks like. Let's see, I have p tag, it opens. Nope, I did not make a mistake. Yep. So sometimes it might not be able to upload right away. So if that happens, just crash the server by stopping it and then click on go live again. Then it'll open it. Well, but it seems like that's the correct behavior, right? We open up the body. I just don't know why it's showing me this third p tag down here. But we can see that we have the first one, and then afterwards it creates a new one for the lorem. Okay, so there's our paragraph tags. Well, what about line breaks, right? We see that we have that whole spacing in between them, and we have that whole spacing in between them because we used another p tag rather than utilizing a line break. So now if I bring it all in, it goes back into the same paragraph tag. But here, if I do something like a BR tag, which is called a break, now when I come back, we see that there's no spacing in between them. They're still within the same paragraph tag. And right after that first section, there's a break, meaning that it's being indented, or not indented, but it's being like an enter, like, hey, this is the end of this line, go to the next one. And then it starts with the lorem ipsum. All right, does anyone have questions about content structure tags?
For the headings, can you only have one of each size, or could you keep creating like H1s?
Yeah, that's a great question. For the headings, can we only have one of each size? The answer is no. You can definitely have multiples of the same one. I would just style them differently so that there's a sort of priority, right? Because these are technically supposed to be headers. So unless they are all the same level of importance, I would use different sizes or different styling for each one of them. Does that answer your question, Anna?
Yes, thanks.
Of course. Okay, it doesn't look like there are any other questions. So let's start going into division tags. All right, so what is a division? All right, or element tags. What is a division? Let's start talking about that. So a div is essentially just use different headers for SEO purposes. Oh, a div is essentially just a minimized version of a body, right? It's just saying, hey, this is another content block that we can put things into. So let's put a p tag in there, put some lorem, and let's actually copy this. And then let's give each one of these a header. Okay, so now we see everything's nicely clean and formatted. We have a division. All right. Inside of that division, we have a couple of H2 tags, and then we have one H2 tag, and then we have a paragraph tag with some ipsum lorem or some lorem ipsum. So now what does that look like here? Well, we can see that we have our headers of 1, 2, and 3, and those are my H2 tags. And here's the lorem ipsum from each one of the paragraph tags. But what's happening down here? I can see I have a division. And in that division is where I hold this H1 tag and this paragraph tag. All right. So it's a wrapper. In this next division, I see that I have the next header tag for the number 2. And in this next division, I have the header tag for the number 3. That's all I'm doing. I'm essentially just wrapping content within a box so that I can later on style it in a repetitive manner or divide the specific content of information from other information within this page. I can have divisions within divisions, right? So I can move this here. Right, and then we can see that we have 3 nested divisions. So I have the division from number 1, I have the division from number 2, and the division from number 3, all nested within one another. Let's take a look at what that looks like here. So nothing necessarily changed, right? I can reload, everything seems to be exactly the same. But notice in our body, all that's being registered is one div, right? In that div, I have the header for the number 1, a paragraph tag, and then I have a secondary div. And now that secondary div is holding two-thirds of the original division. Now, when I open this one, I can see that I have the H2 tag, the paragraph tag, and then the H3. All right, and the H3 is only holding 1/3 of the original division, holding the H3 and the ipsum with our paragraph tag. Okay. Does anyone have questions about the divisions or anything that I've covered so far? Go ahead.
Yeah, is there a preferred method, whether doing it nested or separate?
As far as a preferred method, it kind of goes with what you're trying to create, right? So for example, when I made this TL draw here, right, that division or this header up here, it's just a division, right? This is just a div. This nav bar that we see below here is also a div. Now, these two would not be nested, right? They would be in line with each other. But these buttons, or maybe divs, maybe they have buttons inside of it, would be nested within the one on the outside. This body is also just a div, or content would also be just a div, and it would have 3 divisions nested within it. And each one of those divisions would then have another 3 divisions nested within it. Does that make sense, Brian?
Yeah, I think it's starting to.
Awesome. Yeah, it's all just boxes. All right. So the next one we have is the span tag. So the span tag is kind of invisible, and it may serve no purpose as of right now, but know that it exists. And all it does is you can put a certain number of characters or whatever it is that you want to make kind of different within a span tag. So if I look in the body, I look into division 3, which is way down here. I see this paragraph, and I see that this paragraph has a span tag, right? If I hover over the span, we can see that although it's still part of the paragraph and that it didn't receive any sort of formatting or it doesn't look any different, it is separated, right? It's only its own content saying, hey, this is part of a span. Now, what could this be useful for? Well, what if this needs to be something important, right? What if it needs to be highlighted in red or something like that? Well, I could utilize the span tag to ensure that it is highlighted in red without intervening with the remainder of the text. That's all it is. A span tag is just an easier way of separating content within paragraphs. All right, the next one we have is strong. And let me go up here. Let me put a strong in here. Okay, so what does strong do? Let's take a look at our web page here. Okay, so we had our span tag down here, but now notice this. On the first paragraph, I put strong around lorem ipsum dolor, and we can see that that's different than the remainder of the text. What's different about it? What did the strong tag do?
It made it bold.
Yeah, it just makes it bold. That's all it is. All right, the next one we have is our EM tag, which stands for emphasis. So if strong makes it bold, what do we think emphasis will do?
Italics?
Yeah. Perfect. Yeah. I can look at emphasis here. So here we have lorem ipsum, which is bold. And then we have this portion, which is now italicized by our emphasis tag. Nice. And then we have our underline tag, which I'm sure that's pretty. Are these tags important for accessibility screen readers in any way? I don't know enough about that portion of web development, like as far as taking accessibility into consideration to be able to answer that question, Matthew. But I'll definitely do some research and get back to you as soon as I can. Awesome. All right. And then, oh, the underline tag. So here we have the underline tag. And of course, what that's going to do is it's going to underline our actual text, right? So now we see the underline, we see the emphasis, and we see our strong tags into action. Okay. We can see that those are different ways to decorate all of our information. But then we have this thing called the anchor tag. Well, what does the anchor tag do? Let's create an anchor tag here. And let's have it go to Amazon. Okay, so we can see that this anchor tag now exists, but that anchor tag isn't doing anything, right? Can anyone tell me what an anchor tag is supposed to do?
It's like provides a link.
Yeah, it's supposed to provide a link, right? It's supposed to be underlined and it's supposed to be highlighted in blue so that I can click on it and it takes me somewhere. But right now it doesn't do that. Well, that's because I didn't give it the element of where to go. I think if I hover over it, oh no. I think it's href, right? I can give it href as far as where I want it to go. So now I'm giving it an attribute. This is called an HTML attribute. I'm saying for this anchor tag is going to take in the attribute of hyper reference, right? I think that's what it stands for. Well, I'm basically giving it an address to reference to as to where it's supposed to go once I click on the link. Well, now when I come back here, it says, okay, perfect. I see Amazon is here. I can click on Amazon. And when I click on Amazon, it tries to go to www.amazon.com. But we can see that it's trying to open it within my path. All right. Hypertext reference. Thank you. I appreciate it. So maybe I'm giving it the wrong tag here. Let me try it this way. Oh, it is href. Interesting. Why is it failing? Sorry, everyone, I'm trying to figure out what syntax error I'm doing here that's causing it not to open a different tab. Oh, there you go. Now it's working. It looks like I was missing the S. in HTTP, so I put HTTP rather than HTTPS. But once I put HTTPS at Amazon.com, then I was able to actually travel to the site. So that's great. Okay, so it's working properly. I made my link. When I click on it, it takes me there. Fantastic. And that is our anchor tag. Does anyone have any questions over the element tags that we just covered? I know it's just kind of a boring one, everyone. We're trucking through it.
I have a question. What does the break tag do again?
Yeah, so the break tag will just simply put a new line, right? So we can see that we have this lorem ipsum here. If I add a break tag right after underlined text, all it's going to do is it's going to indent and create a new line right after. Does that answer your question, Andrew?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. Okay, perfect. So let's move on to the forms portion of our lesson. So a form. Now, a form is a lot more complicated than what it needs to be. So let's work through our form real quick. So our form can take an input, and then we'll talk about the different types of input here shortly. It can have a text area. Oh, that's not what I meant to do. And let's concentrate on button for now. We don't have to do the whole select thing. And let's just give this button a submit. Okay, so now we can see that our form exists. Our form has an input field. It has a text area, which is literally for collecting text. And then we have a submit, right? Now, notice that when I click that button, it's saying index.html, and then it has this question mark afterwards. Well, that's because when I click submit, it's actually attempting to send a post request, right? It's trying to send information somewhere to the browser, but the browser doesn't know what to do with it, and neither does my local machine, because right now my form is empty, doesn't have any functionality, right? But now I have my form. Now, when I talk about this input, right now it only collects text. But why would I want to utilize text area rather than input to collect text? Can anyone tell me what?
Multiple lines.
Say again, Brian?
Multiple lines of input.
Yeah, I can put multiple lines of input. There's actual control that I can apply here. I can tell it how many characters it can take. It can take up to 500 characters, where I believe text area has I believe input also doesn't have a limit, but you just can't see it, and I don't think you have as much control as to everything that you can do inside of an input line, where you can control everything that's happening within a text area. Now, our input doesn't necessarily have to be just characters. We could specify the type, right? So here we can see that we can do something like checkbox. Actually, let me just. Let's do text box. Let's also do color. What else we got here? Now let's do date. I'm trying to do some of the common ones you will all use. Maybe I think it's number. Yeah, there you go. Okay, so now we can see that we have something like checkbox. I can click on a checkbox to show that something is completed. If I click on colors, it's actually going to bring up this whole color scheme for someone to be able to collect colors. All right, or I can use the little drop to be able to grab something. If I click on date, it brings up a nice calendar that I can utilize to collect dates. And then for numbers, I can type in an actual number, right? So I can go up or I can go down and go into negative numbers. So there's different types of inputs that you can utilize, and there's different attributes that you can pass into each one of these input fields to make sure that you control what kind of data a user can put into these input fields. All right. I think that's all we're going to talk about for forms for now. Just know that this button, if it's within a form, when you click on it, it's going to automatically submit your form, right? And it's going to attempt to do something with it unless you give that button another purpose or control what the form is trying to do when it is being submitted. And we'll go more into forms later on as we start talking about Axios and start talking about how to make requests with forms. Does anyone have any questions over input fields, forms, or text area as of now? All right. The next thing we're going to talk about now is going to be HTML list. So let's create a list. Okay, so here in this division is where all my lists are going to go. Don't worry about this as of now. We'll cover this information once we go into styling this afternoon. Okay, so I'm going to make an ordered list and I'm going to make an unordered list side by side. So now when I take a look here at my HTML, nothing's happening, right? Nothing has been created yet. Well, let's give it a couple of headers. Let's say coding for today. And let's say things to do. Now I see coding for today has appeared, and I see things to do has appeared as well. Well, what if I want to give them items, right? I have to give it something called a list item. And in this list item, maybe I can say HTML. Oh. And then I can say CSS. Okay, well, what about things to do? Well, I have to code. And I also have to eat eventually. And I eventually have to sleep. All right, those are the three things I have to do. Okay, so now I see coding for today, and this is my ordered list. My ordered list has a list item, number 1, of HTML and CSS. And then I see my unordered list has things to do with 3 items, code, eat, and sleep. What's the main difference between my ordered list and my unordered list?
Ordered list has numbers.
Perfect. Yeah, my ordered list has numbers, right? And my unordered list does not. Now, within this list items, I can create other things, right? I can also have, let's see, what's the easiest way to do this? Yeah, I can also have input fields and include a checkbox within them. So that maybe my user can say, oh, well, I already did this, and I did this, right? And then that way I can see that, hey, these things are completed, or whatever is not checked is not completed. That's it. It's pretty simple. Those are 2 types of list. Does anyone have questions about list? Okay. All right, we just have 2 more. We're almost there. The next one's going to be images. And this one will be pretty quick. So let's see. So an image just takes an image tag. It's also a self-closing tag. But the main difference is for an anchor tag, we had to utilize this href. Well, for an image tag, you have to utilize something called source, which is src. All right, and let's see, what can we do here? W3 schools. Open link in new tab. Okay. 33 schools logo. I can go to images here on Google. Eventually it will open. Oh. I can inspect this image, and here we see that it has a source, right? So I'm just going to copy this source. I'm going to Command C, bring it over. And there it is. My image tag has a source, and I'm giving it the source to W3 Schools logo. Well, what is that going to look like when I go to my own site? Well, now when I go to my own site, I see Victor Platoon, and then I have this image tag with the W3 Schools logo. Does anyone have any questions about the image tag? We'll go into styling it and making it nice and pretty this afternoon. But right now, we just need to know how to make the image tag work. Oh, go ahead, Clarice.
For images that are not on the internet, how would you do that?
Nice. Yeah. So for images that are not on the internet, so let's say I had an image that I can utilize myself. Let me see if I have anything that I can use real quick. Okay, I can't pull up my pictures right now because I want to make sure that whatever I do pull up is okay to have recorded. So I will show that example later on this afternoon, Clarice, but that is an excellent question. Please make sure to remind me in case I forget.
Okay.
All right. Okay, so now the next thing that we have is our tables. This is going to be, tables are pretty easy to use, but it's very important that we know how to utilize tables and what the benefit of tables are. So we're going to specify a table tag. We're going to give it a table head, which is exactly that. It's just the header of a table. Once we give it a table head, we need to give it a table body. And then we could give it a table footer if we really want to, not necessarily. But let's say in this table, we have tick, tag, so. Okay, well, what does that look like here? Okay, so now I see tic-tac-toe there. That's my table head. And let me make sure I'm utilizing the correct tags here. Okay, so now I have my table head. Now in my table body, what I can utilize is something like table row. And this is how I'm going to create my 3 rows. Okay, I have those table rows, and inside of these table rows, I can now create, well, let's just put row in there so that we can see that. Okay, so now I see tic-tac-toe, row, row, row. Interesting, that's not working the way that I wanted it to work. Let's see, before I start getting into all this fancy stuff here. Let's see, I need a table header. And in this table header, let's say header. Okay. Now I can create my rows. Yeah, I thought that's what I had. Or are you saying that these 3 should be inside the table row? I think that's what you're trying to tell me. Got it. That's what was messing it up. Thank you. Appreciate it, Bloomer. Okay, so then I can make my table row and then make my table data. And then put row in there. I messed something up. Okay, we can see it creating here, right? We have my 3 headers inside of the table row. And then I have row, row, and row. And that's just inside of the table data. But now if I wanted to create another 3, there's 2. Okay, and 3. And now we can see row, row, row. And the table is actually being developed. Okay, and now let me make sure that this table header portion is actually working. Yep, okay, so there's the table header. And then let me give it a table foot. Okay, so it seems like that should also be wrapped inside of rows. Okay. The important thing here is that we're able to make a table, right? Inside of that table, we're able to make this row, and then we have those 3 headers. Now notice the difference between those 3 headers, right? I have these 3 headers which tell it how many columns I'm specifying for this specific table. And then after that, I'm creating rows, but those rows, instead of having table headers, they have table data. And that table data is what actually displays down here within the row. Does anyone have any questions about tables?
Hey, Francisco, is that technically considered like styling, kind of?
Not necessarily, because this is coming straight from HTML. We'll go over styling here shortly about how we can create the same exact effect with styling. But this is just a built-in HTML functionality that comes with it. Does that answer your
Right, okay. Yes, yes, yes.
Perfect. All right. So now the last thing that we have to talk about before we call it quits, it's going to be a little bit of semantics, right? We kind of made a mess of our HTML file at this point. We have a lot of content. But what we can do to break up our HTML file is we can give it a kind of a specific main section, article, and we can tell it, hey, these are the different things that you can utilize, right? So now without ruining all of this code that we already have, what I'm going to do is I'm going to comment it. That way it's still available to everyone in the notes. Okay, so now everything is commented. And now what I can do is I can specify, well, inside of my body, I'm going to have a header. Inside of header, well, not inside of header, but within my body, I'm also going to have a main, and I'm also going to have a footer. These are the 3 that I would like everyone to worry about, right? So now in my header, that's where something like, hey, this is a Victor Platoon would go. So I would say H1, right? And then I would say Victor Platoon. After the header, I would have something called a nav. And inside of this nav, I would have a couple of anchor tags. I don't know, home. Profile. And maybe students. And inside of main is where I would start having things like, okay, well, here's my first division. And in my first division, I have a P tag that's holding my lorem. And then finally for my footer, maybe my footer has something like a logo, or it has something that's constant everywhere. But in this case, I'm just gonna put an anchor tag that says home. It says go back to home. I guess it would make more sense if this was on the other side. Right, so here we can see that we have, if I go to inspect it as a developer, right, rather than just opening up the body and seeing all of that code that we had before, now it's nicely formatted for me. I can see, oh, well, this is the header. This is what's inside of the header. Inside of my nav bar, because I want to manipulate the nav bar, I can click on nav and it tells me exactly the 3 elements that are within the nav. If I want to manipulate something within the main body, I can click on main and then look at the contents of the main body. If I want to change something in the footer, I can just click on the footer and change the content there. But this is just simply the common practice for organizing your HTML document so that it's easier for other developers to look at your HTML template and kind of debug it or see the content within it to be able to fix it or change something about your application. Does anyone have any questions about this common practice for organizing? Okay, great. It doesn't seem like there are any questions. Currently, right now, it's 10 o'clock. We went a little bit over our 1 hour time limit. So let's go ahead and take a 15-minute break, and then we'll come back and go into a group exercise. Thank you so much, everyone. I'll see everyone here at 10:15. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I hope everyone enjoyed their exercise and a little break. So the next thing we're going to talk about today is going to be CSS. CSS is mainly just how to style something, right? Today we talked about how to create all these HTML elements and how we can basically put boxes inside of boxes to create a web page. But we never talked about, well, how does it work, right? Why would we want to do something like this? Or how do we make it look pretty? So let's talk about making it look pretty now. As of now, we have these anchor tags, this header, and this main body already showing up inside of our web page, right? It's pretty empty. But we're going to talk about how we can style these things. So the first thing we're going to talk about is going to be the style tag, right? So the style tag, it's going to be part of our header, I believe. Yes, it's going to be part of our header, and we're just going to simply name it style. Now, within this style tag, it's looking for different things that we want to style. So for example, I can go ahead and give my body a color, or actually, I think we want background color of, let's say, we don't want blue, maybe cyan. And now when I take a look at my web page, we can see that my entire web page just turned into blue. Well, cyan, right? So how does this style tag work? So I'm basically just saying to this HTML tag within the header, hey, I'm going to provide styling for the following elements. And when you go and render this HTML template onto the browser, I want you to look at the HTML tag of body. So it goes down, finds the HTML tag of body, and then I tell it, I want you to give it a background color of cyan. And now when I go to inspect the body, here on the right-hand side, we see this style section. Well, I can see that the body has a style that's being added to it in index HTML on line 8 that says that the background color will be cyan. Okay, there's a couple of things I can also do to this. Let's say that I want all my text to be italicized. Well, I can say, I believe it's text decoration. And let's just say I want it all underlined for now. Okay, so now everything that's within my p tag is underlined. All right. If I go and place p tag somewhere else, it will also work. Let's say our anchor tags that we want to change our anchor tags. Let's say I want my anchor tag to have a text decoration of, let's say, dashed, and I want the color to be gold. Well, now we can see that I have these gold right up there. Let me see if I can change this from dashed to line through maybe. Yeah, there you go. And now we can see that each one of these anchor tags have a line through them. Right? So essentially all I'm doing is I'm adding styles to each individual tag by explaining the tag that I want to grab and apply these styles. Now, what happens if I have multiple P tags? All right, so I have multiple paragraph tags, and right now they're all being underlined. Well, what if I didn't want something like that? What if I only wanted one of them? Well, that's where something called selectors starts coming into play, right? Now I'm able to utilize style tags like this. And actually, before we start talking about selectors, we'll go into inline styling. So right now I have style tags just like this, and I'm able to provide a style for the entirety of my HTML template. And it's able to look for the tag and apply the style accordingly. Well, I can also do something like inline tags. So I can say style, and notice that now I'm just providing an attribute, and maybe I can just extend the font size to be, let's say, larger. Well, larger is actually smaller than H1. So what if instead of larger, we just give it something like, I don't know, 30 pixels. Okay, so now we can see that it's changing size. It's all applying to that one element. And same thing, I can go over to a P tag. I can apply the style. And let's give it the background color of brown. Well, now we can see that only on this P tag, where the inline style was applied, does it get a background color of brown, right? We can come up to it, we can see that, and if I click on the P tag, we see that it has a text decoration of underlined from the styling element, and then I can see that it also has a background color of brown. All right, so far we've gone over the two different methods. We've gone over inline styling, which is where I give it the HTML attribute of style to the HTML tag. And then we've gone over the style tag and how to create something for the entirety. So any existence of body, any existence of the paragraph tag, and any existence of the anchor tag have these stylings. Does anyone have any questions about these two methods for creating styles? Go ahead, Josh.
So for the style tag, that's for the body and it precedes the body.
Yeah, so it's for the body, but remember, before we render anything in the body, I have to tell the browser, hey, I want you to look at this before you start rendering everything, right? Because if I put it at the bottom, we may not be able to notice it, but what's going to happen is it's going to render everything first, and then after rendering everything, meaning that we'll get a flash of our entire web page not styled. And then after it being styled, that's when we'll see it. Yeah, and unfortunately it's happening too fast, so I can't show it. But if I was somewhere where there was like a slow internet connection and I was waiting for things to load, then what I would see is a web page that's completely blank with zero styling. And then after everything starts loading, then my styling would start populating. And that's not necessarily what I want, right? It wouldn't be a good user experience that way. Does that answer your question, Josh?
Yeah. So that belongs in the head. This
Correct.
type. Okay. Thank you.
Of course. Go ahead, Clarice.
I'm just wondering if the styling, is that CSS or like, is
Yeah.
it still HTML at this point?
No, this is CSS. So within the style tag, I'm writing CSS, right? And same thing here. Within the style attribute, I am writing CSS, right? This is the equivalent of saying H1 elements will have a font size of 30 pixels. The only difference is that instead of writing it up here, I only want it to apply to this H1 tag. So then I remove it from the style and apply it in inline style. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Any other questions?
I have a quick question, Francisco. No, we're just going through the basics. I guess it's kind of throwing me off guard because I'm so used to just creating a CSS file separately, and then referencing that in the header. That would probably be more so the standard practice, right? But we're just doing this to see like a basic example of CSS in action.
Exactly. Yes, I'm gonna get to linking to a CSS file here shortly.
Okay, cool.
Awesome. Any other questions? Okay, perfect. So now the next thing that I would like to show up is, well, what exactly is going on with, what if I wanted to apply specific text, right, to only a couple of elements, not all of them, but a couple. So now let's say I have home. Well, home is unique, and I want that to be my main link. I have a style that applies to all of my anchor tags, but I want something to be specific to home. Well, we have these attributes that we can add called IDs and classes. So I'm going to give this ID of home link. And what that's going to allow me to do is that I can go up to my style tag and I can place an ampersand saying home link, open up the body. And after I open up the body, I can actually give it a couple of attributes. So let's go for something simple. Let's give it a font size of 50 pixels for now. Well, that's actually going to be bigger than the header, so let's go with 20 pixels. Now when we come over here, if I go to inspect that specific element, we can see that it's 20 pixels. But notice that it's referencing this style by the ID of home link. Now, IDs are unique, meaning that each element that has an ID should only be utilized once, right? That ID is to only be utilized once on one element. Now, what if I had something that I wanted to apply to multiple things, right? Well, right now I have this color brown here, but what if I wanted another p tag to also be the color brown? Well, what I can do is copy and paste it here, right? And now we see these two color browns. But at this point, I'm repeating myself, right? And we all know that in programming, even in HTML, we want to avoid repeating ourselves as much as possible. So instead of writing this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a class. And that class is going to say odd p. And I'm going to give it the same class down here. Okay, so that takes away my styling. Everything's gone. But now I can come up to my style tag. And rather than referencing to, when I reference to an ID, I use an ampersand. When I reference a class, I'm going to use a period. And then specify the name of the class, which in this case is odd p. And then I'm going to give it the same background color of brown. All right. And now when I take a look, we can see that the background color of brown has returned. All right. But I'm not repeating myself. Now, anything that I want to have the background color of brown, I can give it the class of odd p. And we can see that the color of brown is being applied in multiple places. IDs are unique. Classes are for multiple elements. Does anyone have any questions about that? Go ahead, Eric.
Can you go back to your code, please? Just have a quick question. Scroll up to the style. It's about the class and the CSS. If, for example, you have like a general like paragraph style element, and then you define the odd p, which one supersedes which? Does the odd p supersede like the general paragraph?
Yeah, that's a great question. So here's my general paragraph, right? And we have this text decoration underlined. Well, what happens if I give it text decoration none? Well, now when I look at it, we can see that classes supersedes anything given to an HTML tag, right? Well, Now, what if I add an ID into this whole mix? Let's go ahead and say ID. And let's just call it VP. Okay, well now, when I give it to DP, if I make the background color, I don't know at this point, what do we want? Let's say blue violet. Well, now we can see we have, so the original background color is cyan, all right? Then I'm changing it to brown here, and I'm also adding the text decoration none. And then I have my background color again. So now we can see here that the ID comes first because the ID of VP has the background color of violet, which is different than brown, that belongs to the class. So then we know that the ID takes over the class, right? Then it comes to the underlined text. Well, we can see here that in all three of these attributes, there is no underlined text. So that means that the class takes over the paragraph. Okay, so that's the hierarchy. It goes IDs, classes, and then paragraph tags. Does that answer your question, Eric?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Fantastic. Any other questions?
And just to reiterate, the ID is only for like a single element that we're trying to style.
Correct. Yes, ID should be unique and should only be applied to one element. All right. Perfect. So now we've covered inline styling. We've covered selectors, which is going to be in referencing to classes and IDs. And we covered how to make a style element within our sheet. Now, what's the problem here? All right. Well, now when I take a look at my code, I have 160 lines of code. Rather, some of it has been commented out, right? But at the very minimum, I have about 70-ish, I want to say 70-ish lines of code that are actually being rendered on the screen. And this is all the content I'm getting out of it. It doesn't seem like the juice is worth the squeeze, and it doesn't seem like everything's very organized, right? Because now whenever I go to a style class or whenever I go to an ID, I don't have the trick of just pressing command and then clicking on this ID. No, instead I have to scroll down, find the ID, scroll all the way back up, find the proper ID that corresponds to it, and then coming down and fixing things. Now, it may not look like it's a big deal, but we want to follow something like the single responsibility principle, right? We want to isolate behavior as much as possible. With that said, I don't want my styling to be in the same place where I'm creating all of my HTML, right? And that's something that Robert brought up earlier. Well, why am I creating all of the CSS in here when I can just create a sheet that's completely dedicated to handling my CSS? So I have this sheet here called main.css. It's completely empty. And it's not linked at all to my HTML template. So let's take all this styling. Let me take it out. And I'm going to paste it here. All right, it's all inside of my CSS. I'm just going to remove this style tag at this point. And I believe I have some inline style down here. This could stay. Okay. So now I have all of the CSS. I have it compiled here. And actually, instead of leaving this here, because like I just said, I don't want any of my CSS living within my HTML. Okay, I'm just going to add it here. So H1, font size, and I believe it was 30 pixels that we had on there. Okay. So now, what does my HTML template look like now? Well, we're back to square one, right? There's nothing here. Nothing actually has the styling that I wanted to provide for it. And I'm back to the blank HTML that I had just created. Well, how do I link all of this styling over to index.html? Because my classes and IDs are still there. I still have the H1 tags. Well, that's where the link tag comes into play. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my link tag. I'm going to define the relationship that this link tag is going to have, which will be a style sheet. And then I'm going to give it a reference. All right, so hypertext reference, and that's going to go to within this directory into main.css. And then I'm going to close it. So there's my link tag. It's a self-closing tag. All right, it's not like header where it opens up a closing tag. No, this is a self-closing tag. It takes in two attributes at the minimum. One where I specify the relationship, and two where I specify the source or the reference. And now everything is here. Well, now when I take a look at my browser, I can see that Victor Platoon, my web page, now has all of the styling that I had created before. And that's all coming from main.css. Does anyone have any questions about this? And Sean just shared something from FOP. That's a really good reference. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, looks like no one has any questions about these. Well, let me go a little bit into a couple of responsive things. Oh, actually, I was about to skip over this. I apologize. Okay, here's what we'll do. The next thing I want to demonstrate is going to be a little bit of responsive web design along with the box model from CSS. So I'm going to go ahead and comment out all of this content that we have just created here. And I'm just going to create a couple of divisions here. I apologize, everyone. I'm just formatting this so that we could have a good example real quick. Okay, that took a while. 2, 3. Okay, so here we have an idea of a container. We have a division of rows. We have all these contents. Well, what does that look like when I take a look at my HTML here? Well, that doesn't really look the way I want it to look, right? Let me go ahead and inspect this file. Let me take a look at what we have. So if I hover over this divisions, I can see that I have one, my HTML. Then I have a division of row, which has 1, 2, and 3. And everything seems to be going down. Well, what if I want to change those things, right? I want to change these files so that this division is a little bit more visualized. So let's go ahead and let's also comment out all of this CSS. And let's change some of these attributes. So let's make our container, first of all, which is an ID. I'm going to go ahead and give it a border of 5 pixels. I'm going to make it solid, and I'm just going to make it brown. And now let's go into our rows. Our rows will also have a border. They will be 3 pixels. It will be solid, and let's make these blue. And then finally, let's go into our boxes, which is, I believe that's what I gave it. Yep, box. And our box will have a border of 1 pixel. It will be solid, and we'll make it blue violet. Okay, so now we can visualize it a little bit better, right? So there we see our container, which is that brown box on the outside. Then we see the 3 rows, which are in blue. And then we see those purple divisions inside it, which is our next row. And as I float over it with the console, we can see that each one of them have their individual elements, right? If we look down here, I can see that the division has no margin. It does have a border. I told it that its border will be 1 pixel, and it's telling me is 0.8. And then it has a padding, right? And then here's the actual content of what it has inside. Well, now let's start messing around with this portion, right? This content, this padding, and this border. So now we have a border of 1 pixel for each box. Well, I wonder what padding does. So what if I give it a padding of 5 pixels? Well, now let's take a look here, all right? Here's my border, a 0.8. Now there's my padding. We can see that padding of 5 pixels being applied. There's that light green. Can everyone see that? All right, and then within that, then we have content. So padding is the space between my content and my border. Okay, great. Well, what about margin? Let's make margin 7 pixels. Well, now everything is spaced out. Well, now if I take a look here, when I hover over margin, we can see it being highlighted in yellow. And we can see that 7 pixel margin. If I scroll down, there's my border of 1 pixel. Then there's my padding of 5 pixels inside of the box. And then my content. So if we go from inside to outside, it's the space where my content will go, which is the number 4. The padding, which is the space between my content and my border, which is 5 pixels. My border itself, which is 1 pixel. And then my margin, which is the space between my border and the next element. Well, the space between my border and the next element all around is 7 pixels. All right, so there's the relationship between these 3. Does anyone have any questions about margin, border, padding, or content? Okay, pretty straightforward. So then let's go ahead and start manipulating these a little bit more. So now let's give these boxes, let's take away their margin. Let's take away their padding, and let's just give them a width and height. So let's say their width is 30 pixels and their height is 30 pixels. So now we get these nice little boxes. That's great. But what I would like to see is for these boxes to be straight, all right? Well, now we're going to talk about something called display. So here in my row, since I want them to be straight, I'm going to change them to display flex. So now when I change them to display flex, we can see that rather than going from top to bottom, they're going from left to right. Now I can specify these things. Once I give it display flex, I can say flex direction, and it's going to give me 2 options. It's going to tell me, hey, would you like this to be in a column? If I put it back in a column, we can see my boxes going from top to bottom again. But if I would like these to be in a row, I can specify row, and now we can see them going from left to right. All right, I'm just manipulating the order in which they're being displayed. Now, look at the row. How much space is the row occupying still? Well, now the row doesn't have any margin. It does have a border. It doesn't have any paddings, but it's still stretching all the way across. Okay. So there we have our display flex. It's stretching all the way across. We have our flex direction. We could change the size of the width of this box, of this row, I apologize. But for now, I don't really need to do that, right? I just wanted to be able to change my direction so that instead of going from top to bottom, it's going to left to right. Now I can also reverse it. I can do something like row reverse, and that will change it this way. Right now I'm on the complete opposite side. if I really only wanted it to fit my content, I could give it something like with fit content. All right, and now we can see that the blue has collapsed. And now the only thing that's still pretty large is my container. And then comes the magic question, well, how do we center it? Well, it's actually pretty easy. The container is already set up this way. All I can do is, again, add my display flex. And then for display flex, I can justify content and place it center. Oh, and I need to change that flex direction to row. Oh, that didn't work the way I wanted it to. Interesting. That's probably why it's hard to do that. A line item center. There you go. Okay. So now I just made a couple of changes and I did it pretty quick. So let me break down what I just did. So I changed my flex direction. Well, one, I added display flex because I want to be able to manipulate the content within the container. All right. After I changed it to display flex, I gave it a flex direction of column. This way, I can still have the 3 rows, one on top of one another. After that, I justified content center, which in this case, it's not doing anything. All right, we can see that everything is still centered. Now, because I'm in column, I have to align item center in order for the items to show up in the center of my screen. Now, you'll notice that the numbers are 3, 2, 1 rather than 1, 2, 3. And that's because of this reverse and row reverse. If I take that off, we can see that the numbers go back to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And that's it for flex. Does anyone have any questions about flex up to this point? Anthony, you okay?
I'm all right. It just reminds me of the Flexbox Froggy days, you know?
Yeah, Flexbox Froggy's fun. I like that game.
Hey, Francisco, when you use justify content center, did that just center the numbers or it just didn't work?
Yeah, so justified content center did not work. And let me explain why. So if I have something like display flex, right? And I use, let's say I don't use flex direction, or actually, let me specify. Let's say I do row. And maybe a better way to show this is if I give my container an actual height. I don't want to get into responsive design sizes because that's not part of this lesson. So let me see if this will work. Okay, yeah, there you go. All right, so now I gave it a height and width, a designated height and width to our container, right? And I gave it a flex direction of row, and then I tell it to align the item center. So now what happens if I take off align item center? Let's see. Okay, so here we see everything's in a row. We have our divisions, and it has 1, 2, 3, and 4. Well, that's not working very well, right? That's not what I want. So now let's say I do something like justify content center. What's that going to do? Well, it centers my content. That's, oh, let me refresh this real quick. It centers my content. All right, we see that number 5 is dead center on this thing, but it's still just going left to right. Okay, so that's not necessarily what I want. So now let me change this to column. Well, now when I change it to column, we can see that although I have justify content center, it's still centered, right? But it's no longer centered from the top bar, from left to right. It's centered from the side, from top to bottom. Number 4 is centered to the left side. Before, number 2, I believe it was number 5, was centered to the top. But now because we have it in this direction, number 4 is what's being centered on the left side. But that's not what I want either. I want it completely centered, right? So that's why I move to align items center. And if I take off the justify content now, we can see that it pins number 2 to the top. right? And it's just because I changed the direction from row to column. So usually to play it safe, if I'm doing something, I want that something to be centered, I always justify content center and then a line item center to ensure that it stays centered within the parent division. I can't remember who asked that question. I think it was Sean. Did that answer your question?
Yep, that makes sense.
Okay, fantastic. Any other questions? Okay, great. Now, know that today we only covered the tip of the iceberg of everything that there is in HTML and CSS, right? There's a lot more attributes. There's a lot more elements out there that you guys can utilize and apply, and this is only going to grow. Now, unfortunately, we don't have the ability to go over every single possible attribute that's out there. So in your projects, when you start developing your own things, please take the time to do some research, find new cool things. I saw somebody using marquees on one of their project, which is pretty cool, right? The text is just rotating side to side, so that's fantastic. But explore and learn, because the only way to learn is by trying out new different things. Okay, that is going to conclude our lecture for the day. Let me go ahead and stop the recording.